right, just a few quick announcements. After this reading at 5:30, there's going to be a reception at the French House, so head over there for some snacks and drinks. We'll also be selling t-shirts. And then tonight there's a neat thing going on. After the 8:15 reading, Andrew Hudgens is going to lead us on a graveyard walk, and he's going to give a reading of some of Alan Tate's poems by Alan Tate's grave here in the cemetery. So it's a very cool thing. We will have some flashlights, but if you have any of your own, please bring them too. And then one last thing. Apparently the Poets won the basketball game yesterday. And the fiction writers are not happy about it. So there's going to be a rematch tomorrow at 5:30 at Fowler, so come out and play. And now please welcome, oh wait, one more thing.
Andy Williams' sheets are on the wall right there, and I'll put these in the clerk if it's crowded right there, but check and see if you have these.
Awesome. All right, please welcome Diane Johnson.
Thank you very much. Does it work if I sort of stand here with, no? I will use the microphone, but I always feel lost behind this thing. So excuse me while I fool around with this. Is this okay? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to read from a thing that's coming out in January. It's called a memoir by the publisher, much against my wishes. It's not a memoir. I think of it as a history. I'll show you the jacket. It's called Flyover Lives, and it's a book about little towns in the Midwest. I guess I left it there. No, here, a bigger version, if you could see it. Viking liked the jacket, so they used it on there. And I sort of wish it were called Viking, which has more the spirit that I intended of adventure and so on. Anyway, it's a book about little Midwestern towns and long departed people, hometowns, my hometown of Moline, Midwestern settlers, and it's a meditation about America, or hopes to be. I had always wondered how the first settlers in Illinois in the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th survived the ruthless climate and isolation, how they managed to clear the tough woodlands and make their farms, how they taught their kids. Oh, thank you. Hey, good.
It's got a hole back here in the back.
Be careful not to step.
Don't step backwards.
I know, it looks like you lifted it from the outhouse or something.
Were you talking about Illinois or Tennessee?
Might be talking about either one. Certainly.
See if that helps.
Yes, brilliant. Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, well, no one writes much about the center part of our country, sometimes called the flyover, or about the modest pioneers who peopled this region. And yet, Midwestern stories have something to say about American history. Now that circumstance has taken me to live abroad much of the time, or overseas, as I've learned to say, for its hardship military ring, I have wondered more than ever how the first settlers managed to keep it together in those stressful places. A child born in the Midwest, especially in the days before television, is bound to feel herself, and everyone around her, to be marooned in those waving fields of corn, stranded from any ocean or shore, far from other continents, far from the hungry Chinese children we could dig down to. Growing up along the Mississippi River in Moline, I was a child that felt the great world was somewhere else. In towns like Moline or Bloomfield or Chenoa and Watseka, where my aunts and uncles lived, and in many another Midwestern town, you sense yourself to be and are landlocked in the midst of an immense continent, 1,000 miles or more in any direction from an ocean. And I thought I wasn't ever likely to see one. Midwesternness might not interest people from other places. New Yorkers, as we know, are really only interested in New York and in what their ancestors were escaping or how they got there on the storm-tossed seas or their bad experiences on Ellis Island or some evil continent elsewhere. Midwesterners lack a peculiarity or distinction, have no regional characteristics by which to attract or be described. Southerners have bells and plantations and their myths of gentility. The East, sophistication and influence and skyscrapers. The West, cowboys and scenic grandeur. Our very topography condemned us flat, plain on the plains. We were never a tourist destination. In my childhood, none of my relatives had been anywhere else. Tales were not told about distant places, only about Bloomfield or over to Pontiac or Muscatine or faraway Des Moines. Journeys to be made by automobile on two-lane roads along farm sections, commenting on the progress of the crops, waiting for the Burma shave signs to unfold. You can beat a mile a minute, but there ain't no future in it. Saunders corn is back bars, my aunt would judge with satisfaction. I dreamed of escape. My mother was from a little Illinois town, Watsika, on the border with Indiana, and my father came from Bloomfield in the Hacklebarney region of southern Iowa, two towns way smaller than Moline. My parents were happy where we were and thought of it as a big, booming place. But my Iowan father had actually been somewhere once, nearly 20 years before I was born, and may have breathed into me my secret sedition. As a soldier in the First World War, he had been to Venice, Italy. My favorite book when I was a child was called Around the World with Bob and Betty by Phyllis Ayer Sowers. Two children, like my brother and me, were taken by a benign family friend to Tokyo, to Hawaii, to China, to Egypt, around the Horn. It begins, "Oh, Betty, we can't see land anywhere," cried Bob as he ran up the deck to the place where Betty was playing quoits with Lolita, a little Cuban girl, who was returning to Havana with her mother. There was nothing but the blue ocean all around them as the big ship tipped slowly on the waves. Father liked it as much as I did. My father wished that I'd grow up to be an airline stewardess. He thought that would be the perfect role for a girl. You got to travel, would meet eligible men among whom to choose a husband, and, having seen the world, would settle down with less restiveness than he perceived already to exist in me. The catch was that you had to be at least 5'4", and it early became plain I wasn't going to make it. I wanted to be a stewardess too. Back then in the 40s, 50s, stewies were regarded as glamorous globetrotters. And to pass the time between college and marriage, seeing the world was, to my mind, highly preferable to the alternatives that society presented, at least in downstate Illinois: secretary, school teacher, or nurse. Three professions I had resolved from the time I was a child never to touch. For then I would be like my mother and her friends, and all the other women in Moline, Illinois, and I was not going to be like them, even though I had no better plan in mind. It was not that I didn't love and admire them. It was that I could see that their lives were orderly and unsurprising. But I would have to be 5'4". The book, as I mentioned, is called Flyover Lives, but at first I called it Prairie Voices. And there are 8 of these little passages. One is only 1 page long, some are longer. This is the second of them. And the first voice. People coming to America and then coming to the Midwest. The first voice is René Cossé, better known in America as Rana Cossett. Rana Some languages didn't travel well, and French was one of them. A young traveler trustfully setting out from France under his name René Cosset, only to find it quickly changed in Connecticut ears to Rana Cosset. Faute de mieux, he took to spelling it like that, Rana Cosset. His brother Francois's name underwent an even more endearing mutation to Franceway, a spelling he too passed to his children, and there are still Rana and Franceway Cossets. These Cossets were typical of the New Englanders, Canadian and American, who would struggle westward, hopeful, modest, and industrious, leaving behind their languages, old spellings. Rana's arrival in 1711 is noted in the record of his time mainly because of his capture by the English and subsequent history. This is a cousin, Emily, writing to another cousin in 1875, telling the story of Rana's capture. One day, on their voyage, the vessel in which the young men were taken by Captain Matthews and brought into Middleton, Connecticut as prisoners of war, these United States being then provinces of Great Britain, he, with the other prisoners of war, were taken to New Haven and let go at large on his parole that he should not go out of New Haven until exchanged. A little digression about what was going on in New Haven. In New England, Protestantism, Puritanism was well established. The first settlers had been there 90 years, since the Mayflower landed in 1620. The two groups, Puritans of English origins and Canadian French, clashed continually along the borders of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. The violence took the form of savage Indian raids in which Indian braves, egged on by the French, incited to plunder, and religion swooped down frequently on the wooden houses of the stockaded Puritan villages to scalp or kidnap the inhabitants. A famous raid in 1704 had targeted Deerfield, Massachusetts. Perhaps some of you know about the Deerfield raid. French-led Indians attacked the little settlement of log houses, massacred 56 of the sleeping villagers, and kidnapped more than 100 others as slaves and chattel, marching them some 350 miles to the French-held territories around Montreal. Here, the English-speaking Protestant prisoners lived for nearly a decade. Some settled in the French communities and became Catholics. Some resisted, and some of the women, more than you might think, married their Indian captors. Strangely, these seemed always to have been claimed to be Indian chiefs. And eventually, after so many years of leading the free, barefoot life of the forest-dwelling Indians instead of the prayer-ridden strictness of their Puritan families, many of the English-speaking kids were reluctant to go home. Some of the white Indians never went home, white Indians, or paid ceremonial visits, trailing their blanket-wearing Indian husbands and dusky, frisky, bead-bedecked offspring behind them. But the New England communities, passionately concerned for the health and especially the souls of the captured, had been negotiating for the Deerfield captives' release ever since the 1704 raid. They feared that Catholics would try to convert their lost ones or cause them inadvertently to utter some papist formula that would send them right to the devil, whether they knew it or not. Now it was 1711. In the intervening 7 years since the Indian capture of the 100 English-speaking men, women, and children, a deal had been laboriously finalized, a scheme to trade them for French prisoners of the English. Usually these were like Rana, victims taken at sea by the English Navy and dropped off in New England. Rana had only a year or so of captivity to endure. In 1713, a group of Frenchmen was assembled in Massachusetts to be marched off to Montreal to rejoin their Francophone world. It's here that Rana Cosset emerges in the diaries and reports of a Colonel Partridge, the exasperated official in charge of the exchange. Rana refused to be exchanged. Partridge writes to Governor Dudley in Montreal of 2 Frenchmen who will not be persuaded to go, neither by persuasions nor force, except that they be carried. Cosset and Lefebvre. The captain hath used all means with them, especially Cosset, insomuch that I believe if they go into the woods together, they will murder one another before they get to Canada. Cosset positively refusing to go, choosing rather to remain a prisoner all his days, as he saith, rather than go with him. The captain vehemently mad with him, as he saith, will kill him, and it's thought by their violent treatment one towards another that murder had been done if other men had not prevented it. They cannot speak, but some fall to blows. So that is the first voice, the voice of Partridge. And the second voice is how we all descend from greatness. A French friend once teased us about how all Americans believe they are descended from royalty. We denied indignantly that people had such beliefs, but her assertion proved to be true. It seems to be part of our national self-image that we all have a fancy connection to the past. This was borne out by asking my friends, and almost every single one of us has been told about distinguished, even royal forebears. And I ask you all to think about your family lore and see if this is not true. People who came in the early days, whether from Europe, Latin America, or Africa, often brought with them as a legend or in family records a tradition of some grander ancestor, a chieftain, great Talmudic scholar, famous musician, leader, duke, academic, someone out of the ordinary back on the family tree. I assume this is still true for families no matter when they arrive. At least they will have a talented and famous uncle, notable eccentric, or someone very, very wicked. My parents didn't emphasize ancestral myths, and as far as I could make out, our family was nothing at all. We had no ethnic or old country recollections to lend color to family reminiscences. How indeed could I ever become a writer? We were default Americans, plump, mild, Protestant people whose ancestors had come ashore God knew when and had lost interest in keeping track of the details, though my Watsika aunts had documents entitling them to be members of the Princess Wachiki chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, which they enthusiastically were, along with most of the other ladies in the town. I'm going to skip a little bit about Marie Antoinette and some of the things that Cousin Emily writes to Cousin Catherine. Emily outlines some of these things. She says, among other things, Uncle Bliss, one of Stebbins family of rustic Puritans, reckon themselves descended from kings called Hadding, Hothbrod, Wiglaf, Oof, Fraud, and C. Roic Slingband. The Stebbinses trace their ancestry back to 818 BC. A remarkable feat of genealogical persistence. Cousin Emily ends her letter to Cousin Catherine on a plaintive and more realistic note, hoping there was some way of getting their fair share of a spread of Cossack Canadian lands. This regal ancestor don't amount to much when we're in need of more bread and butter for everyone in this Republican form of government to stand on their own merit and be appreciated for their talented head or kindly heart. That's what we all believe, or say we do. There is a vast library of genealogical tracing of American royalty, and Obama's heritage alone is very impressive. Many kings and Irish and English rulers and so on. It's very adroit. Anyway. I'd always had a slightly uneasy relation to my Midwestern origins, as I said, conscious of the scorn that people in more fashionable places felt for the plump, bespectacled, respectable folks that television interviewers like to goad into conservative expostulations about the perfidies of the outside world. I'd also been stung by the French disdain for our American weak grasp of history, and that's one reason for this book. Number 4, My Moline. A few years ago, someone from my Illinois hometown had passed along a book about it, My Moline by John Cervantes. The subtitle is A Young Illegal Immigrant Dreams. Only now, home in California from our visit to France, did I sit down and read it. I opened it with some trepidation. My own memories of Moline, which I had left when I was 16, had over the years taken on a certain configuration of a bland, sound, genial place, which I dreaded the author would refute. Instead, my recollections were confirmed, though from his very different point of view. An unusually dense and myopic child, I had been unaware that Moline had Hispanic immigrants, tracks, boxcars in which people lived, social stratifications, these things that were reflected in Cervantes' account of a welcoming and benign American experience. But to emphasize our connection with the great world of Europe, in Moline, children were taken to view Mrs. Butterworth's Tiepolo ceiling, brought over from some Italian palazzo, my father said Venetian bar, and Tiepolo it was later exposed as being by a painter called Tiziani. But anyway, it was brought over in the heyday of plow manufacturing, on which rested the industrial base of the region and of the Vili automobile factory that had so enriched the founders and then itself foundered. The descendants of John Deere, like his granddaughter Mrs. Butterworth, still resided in Moline and had cultural aspirations, perhaps even accomplishments. We children lay on our backs in her sumptuous library, lined up like corpses on a tarmac, gazing reverently up at the frolicking putti. Proud Moline, we were called, somewhat derisively, I assume, in the rougher river towns nearby, where unlike in Moline, or so we believed, there were jazz musicians, bars, and brothels. Number 5. In Moline, somehow everyone knew everyone's religion, mostly Protestant. The Scandinavians were Lutheran, but those who weren't belonged to a variety of other Protestant denominations, among which our church, in our view, predominated. The pretty church building had been endowed by John Deere himself and was thus somehow the correct place to worship, so that despite generations of Episcopalian forebears, my parents went there, or rather sent my brother and me there, to Sunday school. When you came out of our church, you could see to the left down the street the words Jesus Saves in neon on the side of another building, which until I was quite old I believed to be a bank, but was in fact another church, apparently of an evangelical nature. Our father and mother didn't go to church at all, or not very often, maybe at Easter and Christmas, and sometimes Mother's Day, when my mother wore a white flower to signify that her own mother was dead. I'd be wearing a pink one, signifying a living mother, somewhat redundantly, for Mother was right there. Before we went to find our pew, she would scrub my face with her hanky, which she had daintily moistened with spit. When once I challenged the fact that though my brother and I had to go to Sunday school, our parents didn't, they frostily explained that religion is part of your education, like arithmetic or geography, and we had to go when we were children for the same reason. I didn't really mind. I liked Sunday school, and as a teenager taught the younger children according to a prescribed syllabus that featured interesting Bible stories, always from the New Testament. When once as a younger child I was given a book of Bible stories from the Old Testament, I was outraged by the unfairness and wickedness portrayed in it, and by the way the person you liked least always triumphed, and with the approval of God. Things were not very much better in the New Testament. For poor Martha, for instance, but they were better, and you couldn't regret turning out the money changers and the fact that Judas was punished, unlike Abraham, who so richly deserved it. I thought Abraham ought to have accepted eternal damnation for the sake of his little boy, and couldn't respect his ideas of obedience and blind trust. I'm hardly the first person to have dismissed religion at the sticking point when you first realize it prompts people to do what they know is wrong. But I have an enthusiastic love of dressing up in robes. I wore one when, as an exemplary child, I got to read the lesson at the 11 o'clock service on Children's Day, or sang in the choir. I loved the stately language of the King James prayers, the flags carried in the processional. Our congregational minister, the Reverend William Hodgson, was an Anglican priest from England, and so was the liturgy. We liked to spin romantic stories about his flight from some sin committed over there. As far as I knew, there were 2 Jews in our school, Sherwin Brotman and Gary Cohen. Sherwin was handsome, and Gary Cohen had a blue Studebaker convertible, so each had his allure. Our mothers wouldn't have wanted us to marry either of these boys, but they worried most that we would marry Catholics and be condemned to lives of thankless childbearing and female servitude. As it happened, there weren't many Catholics in our school for our mothers to worry about. They went to a Catholic school, and anyway, they mostly lived across the river in Davenport, Iowa. It was strange, given the resolute anti-Catholicism of some small Illinois towns. The Catholics are now the single largest religious group in Illinois, nearly a third of the population, and a majority on the Supreme Court, which would have panicked my mother and her friends. Their opposition was not based on theology, only on the attitude of the church to contraception. Contraception was a blessing for their flapper generation, as their mothers had borne endless children. My 2 grandmothers had 16 living children between them, without counting miscarriages and stillbirths, which aren't recorded. And they had doubtless had plenty to say about the woman's lot, and suffused their daughters' hearts with gratitude for the arrival of family planning. Looking back to when I was in my teens, dating in Moline seems like something from TV series Happy Days, affirming all the cliches about optimistic and innocent 1950s, and in some ways it wasn't really changed from the 1790s. I went to teen activities at church, went to movies and dances, sometimes daringly to roadhouses where you drank too much, probably not an option in the 18th century, necked a little in the car with the usual first base, second base strictures. Your big worries were your date, your prom dress, and whether the corsage would match and be the right flower. Orchids were hoped for, but most likely you'd get carnations or gardenias. You worried about who would ask you to the prom, and above all, that the right person would ask in time, because our mothers enforced the rule that you had to stick with the person who asked you first, even if a preferred person asked you afterwards. I wasn't interested in boys really then, and couldn't understand how girls could get into trouble when the penalty of possible pregnancy was so dire, marriage, unless the boy joined the Navy, and in that case, unwed motherhood. What you did about that final disgrace, I didn't know. My mother told me years later that she and her friends had a list of cooperative doctors in case, but she needn't have worried about me. My hormones were indolent, my mind on higher things. However, once you got your period, there was the ritual equivalent of female circumcision, the Tampax initiation. Informed older girls aged 14 or so, would break the news that you needn't use the horrible, soggy, unreliable Kotex pads as proposed by mothers and school nurses. Tampons were much better. These were said not to impede virginity. The hymen was elastic and resilient, if we even had hymens, owing to bike accidents and horseback riding. Anyway, we didn't care if our hymens got broken. It didn't seem the business of some male. We resisted the requirement of virginity on nascent feminist principles, though we didn't plan on losing it either. The only impediment with Tampax was not being sure you really had an opening or where on earth it was. And it required a lot of coaching from the other girls, plus a mirror, and standing with one leg on a stool, shaking with effort and nervousness. 6. I wouldn't say my parents were intellectuals, but they were great readers, even if the adult conversation in our house was mostly about someone's golf handicap or unexpected conditions on the 7th green. People read more books in those days. At home, we read classics like Moby Dick or the 40 Days of Musa Dog, and unexpected exotica like Mademoiselle de Maupin, a mildly shocking French novel probably left over from one of my mother's college courses, and the Decameron with the naughty parts in Latin, sending me fruitlessly to the dictionary where cunnus was defined unhelpfully as a cunnus. There were well, it goes on to talk about the Carnegie Library, where my mother dropped me off on Saturday mornings to spend 3 hours browsing and amassing a pile of books to read during the week. I read my way through 100 greatest novels, except for the few the library didn't have, and Madame Bovary, which the librarian didn't think suitable for my age. I read all the novels of Raphael Sabatini and Captain Marryat and Nordhoffen Hall. I most loved the works of Alexander Dumas and adventure stories, particularly with ships and swords. Sea tales are what I loved most, tales of captains, pirates, boys shanghaied. Girls were never shanghaied, but it took a long time to realize that this romantic fate was not likely to be mine. There was nothing to lend desirable drama to my future. In my gender-neutral imagination, I was the protagonist, in my hammock or on deck when the pirates were spotted on the horizon, or when the rough mate with his eye patch went amok on the bridge. Captain Blood, Captain Ahab, Captain Bligh, Captain Paradise, a Canadian captain celebrated in song, who turned out to have been the one who carried Ranacosset to these shores. Sometimes the parents of my friends would quiz me about my captains and smile encouragingly at the things this freaky little girl knew about Moby Dick and Ahab. The books in childhood are the ones that can point your life towards something big. And though in the case of a puny Midwestern girl, becoming a pirate was not a realistic goal, it took a long time for me to relinquish that hope. Eventually, I would devour contemporary novels, mostly set in New York, about fleeing Russia, rough crossings, tenement life, red diapers, and jails, but not until after I had already despaired that I could overcome the disadvantages of perfectly nice parents, not being Jewish, and living in this boring little river town where nothing ever happened. Everyone was a Republican except one boy in our class, Richard Cox, and the tallest building in town was the 12-story Leclerc Hotel, as it was in John Cervantes' day and still is. You hear now that these small cities and towns in the Midwest are hotbeds of meth labs and speed. Can that be true? I recently asked a friend who also grew up in Moline, the painter Stephanie Peake, if she thought Moline had been a sheltered place, and she said, "Are you kidding? It was Brigadoon." Though it's true that daring kids in Moline would try smoking local weed, a noxious hallucinogen that grows in Illinois ditches, and an old American tradition, judging from Louisa May Alcott's story about the Massachusetts young people who get stoned and go sailing. Does anybody know that story? No one ever thought of going eastward. My mother in the 20s had gone away as far as Chicago to the Art Institute. She seldom said much about it, but had kept all her art books, which I loved to look at. And she had had a boyfriend from those days who stopped to visit us once in Moline, where we lived, on his way to take up his post as ambassador to Russia. This impossible interface with the great world beyond impressed me with wistful, disloyal longings. Disloyally, I wished my father would be ambassador to Russia instead of high school principal in Moline, so we could live in Moscow or Tashkent. Among the pictures in Mother's art books were many beloved images, including one, The Age of Innocence, by Sir Joshua Reynolds, that she cut out and framed. It showed a sweet, docile little girl with a hair ribbon, and I found her sweetness and curls vaguely admonitory. Behind the languorous nudes of Titian were castled landscapes and distant and radiant, and it was these I longed for. I especially loved Titian's Venus of Urbino with its mysterious kneeling figure and cute little dog, though it seemed rude the way Venus was grabbing her crotch, as children were told not to do. My mother said it was because the artist didn't want to depict pubic hair. Urbino was in distant Italy, and to think, my own father had been to Italy and France. My favorite parts of Let's Go Round the World with Bob and Betty took place in Venice, where the gondolier pushed off from the marble steps in front of the station and headed down the Grand Canal. The thrilling prospect that my own father had seen and I barely hoped to see, but how? I don't think I'm going to get much beyond 6. So I'd like to really jump to a voice from the 19th century. Just the first person to have gone to to the Midwest, the first person in this chronicle. I have quite a bit about her in her voice, but I think maybe I'll just finish with her own account of what life was really like for women in 1827 into the 1830s. Within a year of her marriage, with the faded fertility of women then, Catherine had her first baby and named her Catherine Ann after herself. They called her Sissy. This baby was followed by Charlotte Augusta in 1830 and Martha Olivia in 1831. When they were 1, 3, and 5 years old, all 3 little girls died in the space of a week or 2. And I happen to have Catherine's account of this, so I'd like to read it. The scarlet fever had been very fatal among the children off in various neighborhoods in the country around the village at certain periods for 2 or 3 years, and I was very much afraid of it, as was the doctor, her husband, and he was among it a great deal. Though we had heard of none for several months, it came to our place in March 1833 and was very fatal. Our dear little prattlers were the first to take it. I wrote March above, but it was February, a little before my oldest child was 5 years old. The schoolhouse was right near on the public square, and we let our oldest one go to school. One day an older girl came leading my little Anne in, and she said she was sick and had been vomiting. I laid her on the bed and could see she was very sick. My husband had gone over to Deer Creek and had not returned, though it was the second day after he left home. There happened to be an old doctor from Washington, the country seat, in town that day, and as the doctor, her husband, was gone, someone sent for him, and I called him in. He did what he thought best, and toward night, Dr. Martin came home. But I think she went into spasms before he came, and continued in them until she died, which was 30 hours from when she was fetched home. After she was buried, the second one, Augusta, we called her Gussie, cried several times to have us go and fetch home her dear Sissy Ann and not leave her in the ground. We had carried her to the burying of her sister. I tried to make her understand that it was only the body that was in the ground, that her soul I'm getting hoarse. And that her soul, her spirit, had gone to God and was alive and would live in heaven with God. But what could a child only 2.5 years old understand about, I've got this, thank you, understand about death and heaven? But it seemed to comfort her. A week or two after her aunt's death, I gave her a piece of sugar to eat. She ate part of it and laid away the rest very carefully in her drawer. I said to her, "Gussie, why don't you eat your sugar? Don't lay it away." She looked up at me very pleasant and says, "Ma, I will save it until I die and go to heaven and carry it to my dear Sissy Ann." And several times when she had sugar eating, she would lay it away and answer me in the same words, or nearly so. About 6 weeks after Anne's death, little Martha Olivia commenced vomiting. After an hour or two, went into spasms and died in 23 hours from when she was taken sick. She died early in the morning and was buried that evening, as they did not keep them long after death then in Ohio. Before she was buried, I got so bad with the scarlet fever that I could not go to the burying of my dear one. I was very bad. They could see the bad inflammation down my sore throat, but it never came outside till the 9th or 10th day. I remember the doctor sat by me 2 days thinking I would die. I think it was Friday and Saturday after the little one was buried. Mr. Gregory was sick and sent for him, the husband, I think on Friday, but he could not leave me. On Saturday, little Augusta, who'd been very sober after her youngest sister died, I had never seen her laugh, came to her pa and says, "Pa, do play with me." He took her by the hands and hopped and jumped her around a few minutes, and she laughed and giggled and thought it was quite a treat to have Pa play with her. I looked at them and the thought came into my mind, "Poor little dear, this is the last play you will have." And sure enough it was. Sunday morning, I felt better and told the doctor he'd better go and see his old friend Mr. G, as he would be waiting for him. So after breakfast, he went. It was a pleasant spring morning, the 1st of April. I had a cousin with me who'd come from the east the year before, Clarice Cossett. She was walking in the yard and with my little girl. They came in, and Cousin Clarice says, "Cousin Augusta says I must take off her shoes and lay them up on the beam on the back porch with her dear little Sissy Ann and little Martha Olivier's and lay her in the cradle. She's going to have the scarlet fever now and die and go to God and live in heaven with her dear, sweet little sisters." She never spoke of them after their death without calling them dear or sweet. I said, "Don't say so. I can't spare you." "Yes, I am, Ma," she said. "Take me up, Kusi, and take off my shoes." And she repeated over the same words she had said in the yard, and then added, "Lay me in the cradle, Kusi." She took off her shoes and laid her in the cradle and rocked her a few minutes. She slept a half hour and waked up vomiting. And I knew she was going then, as she had said. Mr. George Fullerton mounted his horse and went directly after Dr. Martin. She lived 6 or 7 days. He sponged her in cool water and it came outside. But oh, how dark and angry it looked. She lay in spasms 2 days and nights. Oh, I thought I could not see her die in such agony as the others had. And I prayed to God to relieve her suffering and let her die more gently than her sisters had. And she did come out of her fits and lived 2 days after it and died peacefully. And I felt to say, "Thy will, O God, be done, not mine." I was getting better and could sit up some when the last one died, but was not able to go to the burying. When I got up, my house was empty. 3 little prattlers all gone, not one left. And she would have 6 more children, of whom all but one would die before her. So that was life in that period. So back perhaps to Moline and an equally stark thing. On Saturdays, kids went to the movies. Roy Rogers, Hopalong Cassidy, the Cisco Kid, double features. Our moms dropped us off. We could walk downtown to the Orpheus when we were older, but not when we were 11. Besides the features, there were newsreels and cartoons. Throughout the war, these featured indistinct images of explosions, marching, and formations of planes taking off to go save democracy. The familiar voice of the March of Time was almost reassuring, no matter what the sight. One morning, one particular day in spring 1945, the newsreels showed something our mothers would not have let us see. And if the theater had posted a warning that you might not like your child to see this, our mothers didn't know about it. Stick figure humans tottering toward the camera with feeble waving arms, or lying emaciated on bunks, and other images of dead people stacked up and soldiers helping the dying, skeleton people, strangely white against the sordid darkness of their prison, in rags yet smiling. Even the ones lying down would stir their heads and grin. Visions of the skeleton people and the stacked up dead people would never leave me, and to this day they are before my mind's eye. We knew we couldn't tell our parents about this terrible thing we had seen. For one thing, they wouldn't let us go to the movies anymore if they knew. But we also wanted to spare them, hoping they would never hear about these murders that had happened far away. I think that's the end. So, thank you.